To understand the worst economic disaster in modern history, we have to look beneath the glittering surface of the 1920s. On the outside, the economy looked unstoppable. But while the skyscrapers were rising, the actual foundation of the American house was cracking long before anyone heard the first rumble of a crash. The first major crack was a growing gap in wealth. As factories produced more and more, their owners made record profits. But the workers on the assembly lines weren't getting paid enough to actually buy the products they were making. To keep up with the new lifestyle of the 20s, the middle class began relying on a dangerous substitute for real wages: borrowed money. People used credit to buy everything from cars to washing machines, and eventually they used it to gamble on the stock market. It worked through a system called buying on margin. If you wanted to buy $100 worth of stock, you only needed $10 in cash. You borrowed the rest from a broker, who borrowed it from a bank. This meant that the prosperity of the Roaring '20s wasn't built on solid ground. It was balanced on a mountain of unregulated debt that could topple at any moment. While city life seemed fast and wealthy, the rural economy was already failing. During World War I, American farmers had taken out huge loans to buy land and tractors to feed a hungry Europe. But once the war ended, European farms recovered. Suddenly, there was a massive surplus of food on the world market, with far more wheat and cotton than people needed to buy. Because there was too much supply, prices for these crops crashed. Farmers couldn't make their loan payments, which caused thousands of small, local banks to run out of money and close their doors. For the people who grew the nation's food, the Depression had already arrived. Their struggle created a massive, hidden sinkhole that was slowly draining the strength of the entire national economy. In October 1929, the cracks finally gave way. It started on a day known as Black Thursday, when a sudden wave of fear caused stock prices to dip and investors to start selling. By the following Tuesday, the panic was total. Because so many people had bought stocks with borrowed money, they had to sell off their shares immediately to try and pay back their lenders before prices fell even further. The result was a free fall. In just a few days, over $26 billion in value evaporated. The crash was not the only reason the economy failed, but it was the earthquake that finally shattered an already unstable structure. In 1929, the banking system was missing a vital safety feature. If you put your money in a bank, the government did not guarantee it would stay there. If your bank lost its money because the stock market crashed, your personal savings were simply gone. As word spread, panicked citizens rushed to their local branches to get their cash out before it was too late. These bank runs forced thousands of banks to close permanently, locking people out of their life savings. This triggered a downward spiral. When banks closed, people lost their savings. With no savings, they couldn't buy goods. When sales dropped, factories had to lay off their workers. This created a loop. Laid-off workers had even less money to spend, which led to more factory closures and more layoffs. The engine of the economy was essentially running in reverse. By 1933, the nation's total economic output had shrunk by 30%, and industrial production had been cut in half. Nearly 1 out of every 4 American workers was now standing in an unemployment line. At the same time, prices for everything dropped. This might sound helpful, but it was actually paralyzing. When prices and wages fall, old debts, like a house payment, stay at their original high price, making them impossible for families to pay off. The entire financial system had seized up. What began as a bad week on the stock market had transformed into a total breakdown of the way the country functioned. As the spiral continued, millions of people who had done everything right found themselves on the street. Without income, they couldn't pay rent, and an eviction crisis swept across every major city. Families began building shelters out of scrap wood and cardboard in vacant lots. These bitter shantytowns were named Hoovervilles, after the president the public blamed for their misery. Life became a struggle for basic dignity. Former office workers were now standing in bread lines for hours just to get a single meal, and the national suicide rate climbed to a tragic high. Then, a massive environmental disaster struck the heart of the country. A severe drought combined with poor farming techniques turned the soil of the Great Plains into powder. High winds whipped this dirt into towering walls of dust, engulfing entire towns and making it impossible to grow food. Hundreds of thousands of families abandoned their ruined farms and headed west toward California. These Okies lived out of their cars, scrapping for any work they could find as migrant laborers. The pain was even more intense for African Americans, who faced an unemployment rate of nearly 50%. In the South, falling prices for crops meant that Black sharecroppers were among the first to be displaced and left with nothing. Within the home, roles changed out of necessity. As men lost their status as breadwinners, women took on low-wage, unregulated domestic jobs to keep their families from starving. This era did more than drain bank accounts. It tore at the bonds that held communities together and uprooted millions of people from their homes. The crisis didn't stay in America. The world's economies were connected by a web of wartime debts and a fixed currency system that made one country's failure contagious to the next. In 1930, the U.S. government tried to wall off the American market from foreign competition by passing the Smoot-Hawley Act, which placed high taxes on goods from other countries. Other nations immediately struck back with their own taxes on American goods. Instead of helping, this move froze international commerce and cut the value of world trade in half. When U.S. banks were forced to stop lending and call back their loans to Germany, the German banking system collapsed. With no credit to run factories, 1 out of every 3 German workers lost their jobs. It was this atmosphere of total economic despair that helped the Nazi Party gain power, as they promised to fix a system that clearly failed. America's closest neighbors and allies felt the blow as well. Canada saw its exports vanish and its prairies dry up, while the United Kingdom struggled as its heavy industries lost their global customers. By trying to shield themselves by blocking others, world leaders ended up turning a localized structural failure into a worldwide catastrophe. President Herbert Hoover believed the economy would eventually fix itself. He asked businesses to voluntarily keep people on the payroll and insisted that local charities, not the government, should provide relief to the poor. He did authorize some federal loans to banks to keep them from closing, but these efforts were far too small to help the millions of people who were actually suffering. In 1932, 25,000 World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. to demand their bonuses early so they could feed their families. Instead of help, the government sent the military to clear the veterans out by force. The sight of the U.S. Army attacking its own veterans caused a massive wave of public anger. Hoover's refusal to act directly cost him his job, clearing the way for a leader who was willing to try something completely new. In 1932, the public chose Franklin Delano Roosevelt to lead them out of the dark. Roosevelt rejected the old idea of waiting for the market to heal itself. He believed the government had to act as the primary engine to restart the economy by spending money directly to create jobs and support citizens. He called this ambitious plan the New Deal. It had 3 main goals: relief for the hungry, recovery to jumpstart the economy, and reform to make sure the system was never this fragile again. This strategy changed the role of the federal government, making it a direct partner in the financial security of everyday Americans. In his first 100 days, FDR pushed through a massive wave of laws to stop the country from continuing its downward slide. He declared a bank holiday to stop the panic and created the FDIC, which meant the government would now guarantee that your bank deposits were safe. To prevent wild gambling with other people's money, he created the SEC to oversee and regulate the stock market. For farmers, the government actually paid them not to plant crops. The goal was to reduce the surplus, which would eventually drive food prices back up so farmers could survive. To get people back to work, the government created its own jobs. The Civilian Conservation Corps hired millions of young men to live in camps and work on massive environmental projects. Programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority built massive dams that provided jobs and brought electricity to rural areas that had been living in the dark for generations. They also provided direct cash relief to the needy and government-backed mortgages to stop families from being evicted from their homes. Finally, the government tried to stabilize businesses by setting standards for fair wages and prices across entire industries. The first New Deal didn't end the Depression immediately, but it acted as a vital tourniquet that stopped the bleeding and gave the public a reason to hope again. By 1935, the immediate emergency had calmed, so Roosevelt turned his attention to building more permanent supports for the country. He launched the Works Progress Administration, which hired millions of people to build roads and schools, and even employed artists to document the daily lives of Americans during the struggle. New laws were passed to protect workers' rights to join unions, set a national minimum wage, and finally ban child labor across the country. The most important change was the Social Security Act. It created a permanent safety net for the most vulnerable, providing pensions for the elderly, insurance for those who lost their jobs, and aid for the disabled. These reforms ensured that from now on, no matter how bad the economy got, people would have a basic level of support to keep them from falling through the cracks. The recovery was not a straight line. In 1937, the country faced a major setback. When the government prematurely cut its spending and tightened the money supply, the economy immediately stalled, and unemployment numbers began to climb again. This stumble proved that the economy wasn't yet strong enough to stand on its own and still relied on government support to keep moving. The Depression didn't fully end until the outbreak of World War II in 1939. The need to produce massive amounts of military equipment finally absorbed the last of the unemployed, putting both men and women to work in factories running at full capacity. The Great Depression was a decade of profound suffering, but it destroyed an old, unstable way of growing wealth. In its place, the nation built a system with deep anchors and clear rules, ensuring the government remained a primary guardian of the public's well-being.